The signal had been screaming for 11 years, and nobody in the universe gave a damn. Priya Ose found it on a Tuesday, which felt wrong somehow, because Tuesdays on Kessler's Folly were for recalibrating the dish array and eating rehydrated noodles that tasted like salted disappointment. Not for discovering that humanity was not alone in the cosmos. She almost missed it. The listening post sat on the corpse of an old mining platform at the edge of mapped space, a place so forgotten that supply ships sometimes flew past it twice before remembering it existed. And the 7-person crew had long since stopped pretending their work mattered to anyone back on Earth. Ose had been running a broad-spectrum sweep, the kind of busy work that kept her hands moving while her brain slowly pickled in boredom, when a spike crawled across her monitor like a crack spreading through ice. Not on any human frequency. Not on any frequency her equipment was designed to. She stared at it for 6 full seconds, which does not sound like a long time until you're staring at something that should not exist. That is not stellar noise, she said to no one, because the comms room was empty at 0300, and the only company she had was a coffee mug with a chip on the rim, and a faded sticker that read, "World's Okayest Analyst." She pulled the waveform apart layer by layer, her fingers moving faster than her thoughts, peeling back modulation patterns that didn't match anything in the database, didn't match anything in theoretical models, didn't match anything humans had ever conceived of broadcasting on. 9 hours she sat there. 9 hours of her back slowly fusing with the chair, of coffee going cold and then getting microwaved and then going cold again, of muttering at her screen like a woman negotiating with a locked door. And then the outermost encoding layer cracked open, and the pattern underneath hit her like a fist to the sternum. Fibonacci-like decay sequences, entropy markers cascading in deliberate intervals. The mathematical bones of panic, stripped of language and culture and biology, reduced to numbers that meant the same thing in any corner of the universe. Someone out there was dying. Someone out there had been dying for 11 years, and they had been asking for help the entire time, on a channel that no human was ever supposed to hear. Ose's hands were shaking when she pulled up the signal origin coordinates, and she hated that they were shaking, because she was a signals analyst, and signals analysts did not shake, they analyzed. But her hands had apparently not read the job description. She ran the decay math 3 times, because the first 2 times she thought she had made an error. She had not made an error. At current degradation rates, the signal would collapse in 19 days. 19 days and then silence. Permanent, absolute. She stood up so fast that her chair rolled backward and hit the wall with a bang that echoed through the empty corridor. And she was already moving, already walking toward Captain Ajay's quarters, with the kind of stride that makes people step out of your way, even when the hallway is deserted. Captain Neka Ajay had been asleep for exactly 43 minutes when Ose knocked, which meant she opened the door with the expression of someone who had been promised rest and been lied to. "This better be something," Ajay said. "It is something," Ose said, and then she explained. And somewhere around the 2-minute mark, the captain's face changed from irritation to stillness, the kind of stillness that happens in the seconds before a decision that cannot be taken back. Ajay called the crew together at 0400. 7 people in a briefing room built for 20, all of them blinking under fluorescent light that hummed like a dying insect. Laid it out. An alien distress signal, broadcast on a frequency reserved for something called the Galactic Interspecies Compact, an alliance of 31 elder species that had been running their corner of the galaxy for 12,000 years. The signal came from a species called the Veeth, aquatic, bioluminescent, ancient, and currently watching their world die as their moon cracked apart above them and dragged their ocean cities into ruin. They had called for help. They had called for help on the proper channel, through the proper system, following every rule their galaxy had established for exactly this kind of catastrophe. And for 11 years, the answer had been silence. 31 species heard the Veeth screaming, and every single one of them looked at the regulations, looked at the bylaws, looked at the classification of the event as natural, and therefore outside their mandate, and they turned away. An entire world drowned in slow motion. The briefing room was quiet for a long time after Osei finished. Not the comfortable quiet of people thinking. The tight, pressurized quiet of people who have just learned something about the universe that makes them want to break something. Engineer Kofi Mensah spoke first. "We are a survey ship with no weapons, no medical capacity for alien biology, and a crew that could fit in a large elevator." "Yes," Eji said. "And the signal is in alien space that we have no authorization to enter." "Yes," Eji said. "And command will take 6 months to process this through diplomatic channels, by which time the signal will be dead, and so will whoever sent it." "Yes," Eji said. Mensah leaned back in his chair and rubbed his face with both hands, like a man trying to wipe away the weight of what he was about to say. "So when do we leave?" Eji looked at each of them, all 7, one at a time. And what she saw in those faces was not courage exactly, not bravery in the way the recruitment posters meant it, but something more stubborn and less glamorous. The simple, bone-deep refusal to be the kind of people who hear someone screaming and decide it is not their problem. "We leave now," she said. The Uhuru undocked from Kessler's Folly at 0500 hours on a Tuesday. A survey vessel, 60 meters long, held together by maintenance schedules and mild optimism, crewed by 7 humans who had no authority, no firepower, no plan, and absolutely no business flying into alien space to answer a distress call that was never meant for their species. Osei sat at her console and watched the signal pulse on her screen, steady and repeating and patient in the way that only desperation can be patient. And she thought about the fact that somewhere out there, an entire civilization had been calling into the dark for 11 years. And the only ones who answered were 7 people on a tin can at the edge of nowhere. It was not heroic. It was not strategic. It was the kind of decision that looks like madness from the outside and feels like the only possible choice from the inside. Behind them, Kessler's Folly shrank to a dot and then to nothing. Ahead of them, the signal kept calling, and the Uhuru flew toward it, small and slow, and absurdly, stubbornly alive. Tarul Seen had stopped believing in rescue the way old people stop believing in weather forecasts. Not all at once, but in small surrenders, one disappointment at a time, until the absence of hope felt less like a wound and more like furniture. He was 912 years old by Veeth reckoning, which translated to something like a very tired 60 in human terms, though no one on Sethera-Ka knew what a human was yet. And if someone had told Tarul that his salvation was coming in the form of a small metal box full of air-breathing bipeds who could not even swim, he would have laughed for the first time in a decade. He was standing in the Emergency Coordination Center, which was really just a flooded chamber in the last stable structure in the city of Venthal, watching the ceiling crack in real time as another tidal surge rolled through, when his instruments registered something impossible. A vessel had entered the system, not compact, known configuration, broadcasting on an open channel in a language that did not exist in any database the Veeth had built over 9,000 years of spacefaring history. Tarul stared at the readings and felt nothing at first, because feeling things required energy he had stopped spending years ago. The vessel was small, not small the way a compact courier was small, sleek and efficient and deliberately compact. Small the way a mistake is small. Small the way a prayer whispered into empty water is small. Against the ruins of Veeth orbital infrastructure, the shattered docking rings, the collapsed transit stations, the skeletal remains of a civilization that had once built cities in the sky. This vessel looked like a pebble thrown at a glacier. It was broadcasting something. Tarul's communication officer, a young Veeth named Sarah, who still had enough hope left to be dangerous, ran the signal through every translation matrix they had. Came up empty. "It is structured," Sarah said, her bioluminescence flickering with the pale blue of confusion. "But the encoding is crude, Coordinator, painfully crude, like someone trying to sing a symphony by banging rocks together." "Can you decode it?" "I am trying." Tarul turned back to his display and watched the tiny vessel hold position in orbit, just sitting there, impossibly fragile against the backdrop of a fragmenting moon that had been killing his world one tide at a time for 11 years. He did not know what humans were. He did not know that they were made mostly of water themselves, which would have struck him as deeply ironic. He did not know that the 7 people inside that ridiculous little ship had traveled farther than any human had ever traveled before, on no authority, with no plan, to answer a call they had found by accident, on a frequency they should never have been able to detect. All he knew was that someone had come, and that it was far too late, and far too little, and that the crack in his chest when he saw that tiny blip on his screen was not hope, because hope was a luxury for people whose cities were not being crushed by their own moon, but something older and meaner. The furious grief of a man who had accepted his death, and now had to feel something again. On the Uhuru, Priya Ose was hunched over her console, performing what she would later describe as the ugliest piece of linguistic engineering in human history. She had nothing to work with. No shared vocabulary, no cultural reference points, no biological overlap. Nothing except the mathematical base layer of the original distress signal, those Fibonacci decay patterns that had first told her someone was dying. So she built her translation matrix out of math. Pure, stripped-down, universal math. And it was terrible. Whole concepts collapsed in transit, meaning leaking out of every seam like water through a cracked hull. But she pushed through because the alternative was silence, and silence was what had killed the Veeth for 11 years. 3 words made it across intact. 3 words in a shaky mathematical pidgin that sounded to Veeth ears like someone had learned to speak by reading a dictionary upside down. "We heard you." Tarul received the transmission in the coordination center, surrounded by his exhausted staff, and the words hit the room like a depth charge. Sarah's bioluminescence went white, the Veeth equivalent of a gasp. The room was silent for 4 seconds. Then Tarul spoke, and his voice was calm and cold and shaking at the edges in a way that only very old anger can shake. 11 years, he said to no one in particular. 11 years we have been broadcasting on the Accord frequency. 11 years we have followed every protocol, filed every request, met every standard, and the compact, the 31 species who built the system we trusted, gave us silence. And now a species we have never heard of arrives in a vessel the size of a transport pod and tells us they heard us. He paused. Where were they for the first 11 years? It was not a fair question, and he knew it. But fairness had drowned with his city 3 years ago, and he was not in the mood to resurrect it. Sarah looked at him with the soft violet glow of someone about to say something their superior does not want to hear. Coordinator, I do not think they knew we existed until very recently. That makes it worse, Tarul said, and meant it. Meanwhile, on the edge of the Sethara-Ka system, a compact monitoring station detected the Uhuru and did what compact stations always did when an unauthorized vessel entered administered space. It filed a report, flagged the incursion, and dispatched a formal communication. The message arrived on Osei's screen, in clean translated compact standard, which the monitoring station had helpfully converted to the nearest mathematical equivalent the humans could parse. Unregistered species vessel, you are operating in compact administered space without authorization. Withdraw immediately. Non-compliance will be addressed. Captain Ajay read it twice. Addressed, she said, tasting the word like something that had gone off. That is a very polite way to say they will blow us out of the sky. Probably, said Ose. And we are not leaving. No, ma'am. Then I suppose we had better make some noise. Ajay sat down at the communications array and began composing a signal. Not to the compact, not to the Veeth, but aimed back the way they had come, back toward human space, broadcast on every frequency the Uhuru could reach. She did not write a military dispatch. She did not file an emergency request through proper channels. She wrote the truth in plain language and threw it into the dark. This is Captain Neka Ajay of the survey vessel Uhuru, currently in orbit above an alien world called Setharaka, where a species called the Veeth are dying because their moon is breaking apart, and no one in the galaxy will help them. We are 7 people on a ship with no weapons and no capacity to do what needs to be done. I am asking any human vessel within broadcast range to come. Military, civilian, commercial, it does not matter. Bring what you have, bring who you are, and come. She paused before adding the last line. They have been alone for 11 years, and we will not leave them alone again. The signal went out at the speed of light, which is very fast, and not nearly fast enough. Below them, Setharaka turned in the dark, its oceans churning under the gravitational violence of a moon that was slowly tearing itself apart. And in those oceans, 1 billion beings lived and died, and waited for something that the most advanced civilizations in the galaxy had decided they did not deserve. And in orbit, 7 humans in a tin can looked down at a world they could not save and refused to leave. Tarul watched the Uhuru on his display for a long time that night. He did not send a response to their message. He did not acknowledge their presence. He watched the tiny blip hold its orbit, steady and unmoving, a pebble that would not roll away, and he felt the anger in his chest shift into something he did not have a word for, something between fury and wonder, the feeling of watching someone do a thing that makes no sense, and recognizing in that senselessness something terribly, painfully close to love. He turned away from the screen. He went back to work. There were people to coordinate, shelters to reinforce, tidal warnings to issue, and a world to hold together with his bare hands for one more day. But he kept the channel open, just in case the pebble had something else to say. The first ship arrived 41 hours after Ajay's broadcast, and it was not a warship or a rescue cruiser or anything that would make a reasonable person feel confident about the future of an alien civilization. It was a grain hauler called the Fat Margot, 600 tons of agricultural cargo bound for a colony on Kepler 442b, captained by a woman named Dina Sokolova, who had heard Ajay's message while eating lunch and had turned her ship around before she finished chewing. I have wheat, Sokolova said over the comm, her voice carrying the flat pragmatism of someone who hauls food for a living and does not see the point of decorating a sentence. I have wheat and a pressurized cargo bay and 2 engineers who are not entirely useless. Where do you need me? Ajay stared at the comm for a moment. Everywhere, she said. Then more came. A mining consortium diverted 3 ore processors from an asteroid belt operation, each one a hulking industrial brute built to chew through rock, completely useless for delicate rescue work, and completely welcome anyway. A hospital ship from the Jupiter Medicaid Corps changed course mid-rotation, staffed by doctors who had never treated anything that was not human, and who immediately began downloading every scrap of Veeth biological data Ose could translate. 2 retired naval frigates showed up running on backup systems and creative swearing, crewed by veterans who had been heading to a reunion and decided the reunion could wait. A university research vessel full of graduate students who had never left the solar system arrived broadcasting academic credentials like a nervous kid showing ID at a bar. Civilian yachts, cargo shuttles, a converted ferry that still had the passenger safety instructions bolted to the walls. And then, and this was the one that made Osei put her head down on her console and breathe very carefully for 30 seconds. Ship. The Esperanza. 60,000 people in a mobile city, mid-transit to a colony world they had spent a decade planning to reach, and they had held a vote. The vote was 60,000 to 14,000. 60,000 people looked at a message from a stranger, asking for help on behalf of a species they had never heard of. And they turned their home, their future, their children's future off course and into the unknown. Nobody ordered them to come. There was no government mandate, no military directive, no chain of command that connected a grain hauler captain eating lunch to a generation ship holding a democratic vote to a cluster of graduate students with more enthusiasm than sense. They came because they heard. That was it. That was the whole reason. On the compact monitoring station at the edge of the system, a Rithani analyst named Veska watched the human vessels arrive and experienced something her species did not have: a convenient biological mechanism for confusion. The Rithani were insectoid, ancient, and built for logic the way a bridge is built for weight, structurally, fundamentally, without apology. And Veska had administered 17 system-level events in her career, each one proceeding according to predictable patterns of species behavior that had not varied in millennia. Species received threat of sanctions and withdrew. Species calculated cost-benefit ratios and acted accordingly. Species behaved like rational actors because the entire compact framework was built on the assumption that rational self-interest was the universal operating system of intelligent life. The humans did not withdraw. The humans did not calculate. The humans kept coming, and when Veska transmitted the compact's withdrawal order to each new arrival, the responses she received back were so varied and so bizarre that she started saving them in a separate file. One captain sent back a single word that her translation software flagged as anatomically unlikely. AP. Another sent a long, polite message explaining that they were very sorry, but they were quite busy at the moment, and would be happy to discuss jurisdictional matters at a later date, perhaps over tea. And was tea something the Rithani enjoyed? A third simply did not respond at all, and continued on course as if the most powerful governmental body in the galaxy had not just told them to stop. Veska reported to her superior, Adjudicator Sarathian, with the closest thing to bewilderment her species could produce. Quote, "They have no unified command structure," Veska said. "They do not coordinate. They do not follow a single authority. They arrive in vessels ranging from military surplus to what I can only describe as a recreational boat. And when I tell them to leave, they respond with either politeness, profanity, or silence, none of which our enforcement protocols are designed to address." Sarathian, who was very old and very patient, and had watched civilizations rise and fall like weather patterns, considered this. How many vessels now? 300 and rising. Rising. They appear to be telling each other about the situation through informal channels, and each one who hears decides independently to come. It is, Veska paused, searching for the word, it is contagious. Sarathian filed this information in the part of her mind reserved for things that did not fit into existing models, and would need to be revisited later, possibly with stronger analytical frameworks. On the surface of Setharaka, or rather in the churning oceans beneath the surface, humans and Veeth began the impossible work of saving a world together. The challenges would have been funny if they were not also lethal. Humans could not breathe underwater. Veeth could not survive on the surface. Electricity. Veeth technology ran on bioluminescent chemical reactions, and the two systems regarded each other with the mutual incomprehension of a toaster and a fish. Engineer Kofi Mensah spent his first 12 hours on Setharaka trying to establish a working interface between human computers and Veeth communication networks, and described the experience as trying to teach a calculator to have feelings. But they worked. They worked with the frantic, ugly, improvised energy of people who do not have the luxury of doing things properly. A mining laser was recalibrated to cut lunar fragments, not precisely, not elegantly, but enough to shatter the pieces that posed the most immediate threat to the coastal cities below. Cargo containers were pressurized and flooded to serve as temporary aquatic shelters, because the Veeth needed water the way humans needed air, and the fastest way to house refugees was to fill a metal box with ocean. The medical AI on the inside. Hospital ship was retrained on Veeth physiology in 72 hours, which was not enough time, not even close. And the first treatments were rough and sometimes dangerous, and once genuinely terrifying, when a dosage calculation went wrong and a Veeth patient's bioluminescence went dark for 9 seconds before flickering back. But the patient survived, and the doctor who had made the error sat in the corridor afterward with her hands over her face and her shoulders shaking. And Kofi Mensah sat next to her and said nothing, because sometimes the best thing you can do for someone who almost killed a person by trying to save them is just sit there and let them shake. Tarul watched all of this. He watched humans nearly drown installing underwater communication relays. He watched them burn their hands on equipment they had modified so aggressively that the safety features had been the first thing removed. He watched a 23-year-old graduate student named Marcus Chen worked for 31 hours straight on a tidal prediction model, collapse unconscious at his station, get carried to a cot, sleep for 4 hours, and then get up and go back to work with granola bar crumbs in his hair and the wild, focused eyes of someone who has found the thing they were put on this earth to do. And Tarul began to understand something that the Compact, with all its 12,000 years of wisdom, had never grasped. The humans were not brave. Brave implied a calculation, a weighing of fear against duty, a conscious decision to act despite the risk. The humans had not calculated anything. They had heard a sound in the dark, and they had moved toward it, the way a hand reaches for a falling cup before the brain has time to decide whether the cup is worth catching. It was not courage, it was reflex. And it was the most terrifying and beautiful thing Tarul had ever seen. On the 72nd hour, a cargo hauler miscalculated the trajectory of a lunar fragment. The fragment was the size of a small building, tumbling through a decaying orbit, and the hauler pilot, a man named James Okafor, who had 3 children and a mortgage and a dog named Biscuit, tried to nudge it off course with his ship's mass and got the math wrong by a fraction of a degree. The fragment hit the hauler broadside. 17 people died in vacuum in the time it takes to blink. The fleet went quiet for 11 minutes. Then they went back to work. Because 17 people were dead, and 800 million were still alive, and the moon was still breaking, and there was no time, there was never enough time, and the only thing worse than losing 17 people would be making their deaths mean nothing by stopping. Tarul received the casualty report in his coordination center, and read the names he could not pronounce of people he had never met who had died saving a world that was not theirs. He set the report down. He placed one hand flat on the surface of his console, and his bioluminescence, which had been the dull gray of exhaustion for years, flickered, just once, just for a moment, to the deep gold that the Veeth reserved for mourning the honored dead. He did not know their names, but he would learn them. The Rathani warships arrived on day 9, and they were not the kind of ships that arrived to help. There were 3 of them, each one the length of a city block, each one carrying enough firepower to reduce a continent to glass, and they took position at the edge of the Setharaka system, with the calm, mechanical precision of a predator that does not need to hurry, because it knows its prey cannot run. Adjudicator Sarathian watched their deployment from her station, and felt the weight of 12,000 years of compact authority settling into the room like a cold fog. This was the procedure. An unauthorized incursion into compact space had been identified. Diplomatic channels had been exhausted, and the next step, the step that had worked on every species in recorded galactic history, was the arrival of warships and the issuance of a final ultimatum. She composed the message herself. Attention human vessels in Setharaka system, you have 48 hours to withdraw all personnel and vessels from compact administered space. Failure to comply will result in forced removal. This is your final notice. 412 human vessels received the message. Captain Ajay read it in the cramped bridge of the Uhuru, which had become the unofficial nerve center of a fleet she had never asked to lead, and did not have the rank, or the resources, or frankly, the temperament to coordinate, but which had somehow decided she was in charge, because she had been the first one here, and humans, she was learning, had a deep and inconvenient loyalty to whoever showed up first. She read the ultimatum twice. She looked out the viewport at Setharaka turning below them, its oceans dark with debris, its coastlines reshaping in real time, as tidal forces dragged the seafloor in directions the seafloor had never been meant to go. Moon fragment stabilization was at 40%. Evacuation was at 60%. 48 hours was not enough. It was not close to enough. Ajay sat at her console and composed a reply that she would later be asked to explain to a military tribunal, and which she would, at that tribunal, read aloud from memory without changing a single word. We know you can destroy us. We have seen your ships, and we understand what they can do. We are not soldiers, most of us. We are haulers and miners and doctors and students, and people who were on their way somewhere else when we heard that someone was dying. We will not fight you because we did not come here to fight. But we will not leave because we did not come here to leave either. There are people in the water below us who have been calling for help for 11 years, and we can hear them. If you need us to go before we are finished, you will have to move us yourselves. We will not resist, but we will not stop. She sent it, and then she went back to work, because there were supply distribution schedules to review. And she had learned that the universe would do what it wanted, and the only thing she controlled was the next task on her list. Seraphine received Ajay's message and read it 4 times. She was the most senior Rathani adjudicator in active service, 1100 years old, and she had administered the decline of civilizations before. She had watched species burn, drown, starve, and extinguish themselves through war or stupidity or simple cosmic bad luck, and she had done so with the dispassion her role required, because the Compact's founding principle was that natural processes, however tragic, were not the Compact's responsibility to interrupt. It was a good principle. It was a clean principle. It had kept the peace for 12,000 years. And right now, reading the words of a woman in a survey ship, who was telling the most powerful military force in the galaxy that she would not leave a dying world because she could hear the people in the water, Seraphine felt that principle crack down the middle like a bone under too much weight. She did not show it. She was Rathani. Rathani did not crack. But she opened the Setharaka file. Not the summary, the original file, the one that went back 30 years to the first geological surveys, the one that nobody had read in full, because it was buried under 11 years of bureaucratic sediment. She read it in 3 hours, and what she found in those buried layers changed everything. The Veith's moon had not fragmented on its own. 4,000 years ago, the Compact had authorized the construction of a hyperspace transit lane through the Setharaka system, a standard infrastructure project, approved by committee, built by contractors, used by millions of ships for centuries. The gravitational distortion from that lane, accumulated over 4 millennia, had destabilized the moon's orbit. Compact had not just ignored the Veith's distress signal. The Compact had caused the disaster. And then, and this was the part that made Seraphine sit very still for a very long time, A Rethani review board had examined the geological data, identified the connection to the transit lane, and reclassified the event as natural geological process to avoid compact liability. Her own species had buried the truth. Her own species had watched a world die and called it weather. Seraphine stared at the file on her screen, and for the first time, in 1100 years, she felt the sensation the Rethani called Venka, which translated roughly as the shame of a system that has outlived its integrity. She had two options. She could close the file, uphold the classification, enforce the ultimatum, and watch the human fleet scatter under threat of destruction. The compact would survive, the precedent would hold, and in 100 years, no one would remember. Remember the Veeth, except as a footnote in a geological survey. Or she could do something else. She chose something else. Seraphine copied the full unredacted file, geological surveys, transit lane authorization records, gravitational impact assessments, and the Rethani Review Board's reclassification order. And she sent it to every compact species delegation simultaneously. Not to the humans, to the 30 other species who had sat in silence for 11 years, believing the Veeth's death was natural and therefore not their problem. She sent it with a single annotation, "For your review." The effect was immediate. Within hours, the compact's internal channels erupted with the kind of chaos that happens when a very old institution discovers it has been lying to itself. 3 species broke ranks and sent aid ships to Sathara within the first day. By the second day, 9 species had dispatched vessels, not because they had experienced a moral awakening, but because Seraphine's leak had made inaction into a political position, and no species wanted to be seen standing next to the Rethani when the historical record was written. The Rethani warships received new orders on the morning of the 47th hour, 1 hour before the ultimatum expired. Stand down. Withdraw to monitoring distance. The ultimatum was rescinded. There was no apology. There was no acknowledgement of fault. There was simply silence where a threat had been, which is not the same as peace, but is at least the absence of war. On Sathara, Tarul received word of the compact's withdrawal and the incoming aid ships, and he did not celebrate, because celebration was for people who had not spent 11 years learning that the universe was a machine designed to watch you drown. But he opened a channel to the Uhuru. "Your captain," he said to Osei. His words filtered through the crude, mathematical translation layer that still made everything sound like a fever dream narrated by a calculator. "Your captain told the warship she could hear us." "She did," Osei said. "We have been broadcasting for 11 years, Tarl said, and no one heard. And your captain has been here for 9 days, and she hears us. This is either a very good translation error, or your species has a defect I do not understand." Osei was quiet for a moment. "It is not a defect," she said. "Then what is it?" Osei thought about this. She thought about Ajay composing her message to the warships with steady hands and tired eyes. She thought about Dina Sokolova turning her grain hauler around mid-bite. She thought about 60,000 people on the Esperanza voting to change the course of their entire future for strangers they would never meet. She thought about James Okafor and his 17 crew, who were dead because they had tried to push a moon with a cargo ship. "I do not know what it is," she said, "but it is not something we can turn off." Tarul was silent for a long time. Then his bioluminescence shifted to a color Osei's instruments could not classify, something between the gold of morning and the white of wonder. A color that did not have a name in any language because it described a feeling that most species never needed a word for. The feeling of being heard after you had stopped believing anyone was listening. 6 months later, the ocean cities of Sathara were still broken, but they were no longer dying. The moon fragments had been redirected or destroyed through a combined effort that no historian would ever be able to describe neatly, because it had not been neat. It had been ugly and improvised, and held together by mining cables and modified cargo ships, and the kind of engineering that makes textbook authors weep into their hands. The tidal forces were diminishing. The water was settling. 800 million Vith had survived out of 1.2 billion, which was a number that looked like victory on a spreadsheet, and looked like 400 million dead people when you stopped and thought about it for more than a second. Tarul did not stop thinking about it. He thought about it every morning when he opened his eyes in the temporary shelter that served as his office. Thought about it when he reviewed reconstruction reports. Thought about it when he walked the corridors of Venfall and past the empty chambers where families had lived before the sea took them. But the water was settling, and that mattered. The cost to humanity was printed in a report that Captain Ajay received on a datapad while standing in the Uhuru's cargo bay, which had been converted into a supply distribution center, and smelled permanently of seawater and instant coffee. 203 dead, 47 ships lost, an interstellar diplomatic incident that would take decades to untangle, and a formal notification from the UN Stellar Corps that Captain Neka Ajay was under investigation for unauthorized diversion of military assets, conduct unbecoming, and approximately 14 other charges that boiled down to, you did something extraordinary and we need to punish you for it because the paperwork demands a villain. Ajay read the notification. She folded it. She put it in her pocket. She went back to coordinating relief distribution because there were 300,000 Vith in temporary shelters who needed clean water filtration, and her feelings about her own career were not going to filter a single drop. On the ocean floor of Sathara Ka, in a deep trench that had survived the tidal destruction because the planet itself had sheltered it like a cupped hand, Tarul oversaw the construction of something that was not on any reconstruction plan. A memorial. It rose from the seabed like a living thing. Bioluminescent coral cultivated into spiraling towers that pulsed with light in a pattern that anyone who had spent time on Sathara Ka in the last 11 years would recognize instantly. The distress signal. The same modulation, the same decay sequence, the same mathematical cry for help that had been broadcast into the void for over a decade, now rendered in light instead of radio waves, glowing in the deep water like a heartbeat that refused to stop. But Tarul had added something, woven into the signal pattern, threaded through the spaces between the Vith frequencies like a secret whispered inside a shout, was a second message, encoded on a band so specific that only one kind of equipment in the known universe would detect it. Human equipment. Crude, brute force, wide-spectrum scanning arrays that swept frequencies no sophisticated species would bother monitoring. The same kind of equipment that had heard the Vith in the first place. Osei found it 3 days after the memorial was activated, because of course she found it. She had been listening to everything that came out of Sathara Ka with the obsessive attention of a woman who had learned that the most important sounds are the ones nobody is supposed to hear. She ran the signal through her translation matrix. 3 words. Not help us. Not save us. We hear you. She sat at her console and read those words, and did not move for a long time. And when she finally did move, it was to take off her glasses and press her palms against her eyes, not because she was crying, but because some things are too precisely shaped to look at directly, and you need a moment to let them settle into a place where they fit. The memorial would broadcast for as long as the Vith existed. A permanent answer encoded in light, aimed at ears that should never have been listening, saying the only thing that mattered. You called into the dark, and someone came. We will not forget what that felt like. On the Compact's capital station, a structure so old that some of its corridors predated the extinction of species that had helped build it, the 31 elder species convened to address what they were calling the human question. The debate lasted 9 days. It was, by Compact standards, extremely heated. which meant that delegates occasionally used adjectives. Simple. Humanity did not meet any of the established criteria for compact membership. Their technology was primitive by galactic standards. Their political systems were fragmented and noisy. Their species had been spacefaring for less than 300 years, and they had a documented tendency to make decisions based on what one Rathani delegate called an apparent neurological inability to prioritize self-preservation. But they had done something no compact species had done in 12,000 years. They had answered a distress call that was not addressed to them, in space they had no right to be in, at a cost they had no obligation to pay. And they had done it not as a government or a military or an institution, but as individuals who heard a sound and could not ignore it. The compact had no framework for this. They had classifications for allies, adversaries, client states, observer species, and protectorates, but they did not have a classification for a species that shows up uninvited to your emergencies and refuses to leave until the emergency is over. So, they made one. It took 9 days of debate and 700 amendments and one memorable incident in which a delegate from the aquatic mirthcall species publicly wept or produced the mirthcall chemical equivalent of weeping, which smelled like burnt sugar and briefly evacuated a corridor. But they made one. Recognized respondent species. A new category, the first created in 12,000 years of compact governance, granting humanity a permanent legal right to answer distress calls in compact space. Not membership, not equality, something stranger. Permission to care. Sarathian authored the final draft of the resolution and attached to it an internal memo that was classified as confidential, which meant that it was read by every delegate within the hour. The humans possess no technology we cannot surpass, no military capability we cannot overwhelm, and no political leverage we cannot neutralize. They are, by every metric we value, insignificant. I am forced to report, however, that they have introduced a variable our models do not account for. They appear to be unable to ignore a cry for help. This is not a strategic posture. It is, as far as we can determine, involuntary. I advise the compact to update its projections accordingly. A species that cannot be deterred by self-interest is by definition unpredictable. Unpredictable actors in a stable system are dangerous. But I confess, and I will deny this if quoted, that the system was perhaps too stable and too quiet. For 11 years we could hear the Veeth. We simply chose not to answer. The humans could not choose. I am no longer certain which response reflects greater sophistication. The memo leaked within a day. It spread across compact space like fire through dry grass, and somewhere in the vast machinery of galactic civilization, something shifted, not dramatically, not with trumpets or declarations, but in the small, tectonic way that things shift when an idea enters a system and cannot be removed. The idea that silence is a choice, and that choosing it has a cost. Priya Ose returned to Kessler's Folly 4 months after the Sathara Ka crisis ended. The station had changed. The equipment had been upgraded. New arrays, new processors, new scanning capacity that would have made her old setup look like a child's toy. The crew had tripled. The mission was no longer stellar cartography. It was listening, specifically listening on frequencies no human was supposed to be able to hear, scanning the dark for patterns in the noise, for mathematical structures hiding in the background radiation of the universe, for the signals that nobody sent to humanity, because nobody knew humanity was listening. Ose sat at her new console on her first night. Back, and she ran a broad spectrum sweep. The same kind of sweep she had been running on the Tuesday she found the Veeth. And the noise of the universe filled her headphones. Stellar wind, pulsar clicks, the deep hum of cosmic background radiation that sounded like a universe muttering to itself in its sleep. And somewhere in that noise, faint, repeating, patient, another signal. She leaned forward. Her hands did not shake this time. She marked the coordinates, flagged the waveform, and began the long, careful work of peeling back the layers. Outside the viewport, the stars burned in their ancient patterns, indifferent and vast, and full of sounds that no one was supposed to hear. But someone was listening now, and somewhere in the dark, a voice that had been calling with no hope of an answer was about to learn what the Veeth had learned, what the Compact had learned, what the universe was slowly and reluctantly beginning to understand. That humans hear things, and when they hear things, they come. And once they come, they do not leave, not until the screaming stops.